Hey friends, I have something I want to show you. On Holy Saturday, the Bishop of Turin, because of everything going on in the world, people can't make it to Mass. He's going to put the Shroud of Turin on display on television. It'll be streaming online. Should be out about 11 a.m. Eastern time, but fact check that in case something changes. So I have something I want to show you, and there's some insights I want to give you on what you're going to see. Ignore the toys in the background. Hopefully kids don't come looking for them. Let's take a look. The Shroud of Turin rarely goes on display, so this is a pretty cool thing. What I have here is pretty cool too. This is a full-size photographic replica of the Shroud of Turin. It was a photograph taken by the official photographer, shout out to Barry Schwartz. He took this photograph during the 1978 Stirp investigation. There are only about 100 of these in the world from what I hear. So this is going to be interesting to look at. There's a lot going on, as you can see, so I want to help you navigate it. It's a 14-foot long by 4-foot wide, roughly, triple finely woven linen cloth. Here, we'll take a closer look. One of the first things that's going to stand out to you when you look at the cloth are these burn marks. So this cloth was folded. You can see the creases because the burns run along the creases in a particular way so that it could fit into a metal box, and it was stored in a monastery which was on fire. We call this the 1532 Fire of Chambray. And the metal box began to melt and fall through this linen cloth. So these charred marks are going to stick out to you. And then 2 years later, some Poor Clare nuns actually sewed some cotton patches onto this linen cloth. If you look very closely, you can even see their stitch marks. So this is probably the first thing that's going to stick out to you. The monk, we believe, tried to save it by pouring some water on it. And so you'll see some water stains too. Now, because of the way this was folded, these are consistent throughout. So you're going to see burn marks, water stain, burn marks, water stain, and all the way up the shroud. That'll be the case. So if you're able to get past the burn marks and the patches and the water stains right up the middle, you can start to make out the image of a man there. So at the top of your screen, you have the head, the face. At the bottom, you have the hands. You can see the arms then going up from the hands. What's interesting about this image is actually the image of this man is a photographic negative. Some of you aren't going to know what I'm talking about, and I'm dating myself. But cameras used to have mechanical shutters within them which would open and allow a little bit of light in, and it would imprint the image, but the reverse colors of the image and in the reverse the flop of the image itself on a photographic material, negative we call it, and then those you would take to Walgreens or Walmart and have them produced into photographs. This somehow, it almost seems miraculous, is a photographic negative. We'll talk about how that might even be a possibility here in just a bit. And I'm on the other side now so you can see his back. This cloth is exceptionally long because the man was lying on his back, and then the top part, and so you can see the top of the head at the top. You can see the back, the buttocks, the back of the legs, the calves, and then the feet down at the bottom. But he was lying on his back, and then the top, the other section of cloth, was folded up over the top of him. But if you were to reverse the colors and flop the image back, do a negative of the negative, in a sense produce a photograph from this negative of this man, which, by the way, a negative shouldn't be imprinted on a triple finely woven linen cloth. That just isn't really a possibility. Seems like something miraculous. This is what you would get. So you can see the front of the man there. It's quite striking. And his backside. And if we do the same with the face, essentially producing a photograph, this is what you get. A couple things about this here. The blood on the image of the man. And by the way, I keep calling this the man, right? Because we don't know if this is Jesus. The church doesn't make a claim on that. She essentially says, let science figure it out. And science has been working on what are the origins of the shroud? Where does it come from? Where has it been? But the church does say we can highly reverence the Shroud of Turin because it accurately portrays what our Lord went through for us. We'll take a look at all of his wounds here in just a moment. But I want you to notice the blood on his forehead, which is not part of the image. It's just real blood. And there's actually no image underneath the blood, which is interesting too. It means that the image imprinted itself on the cloth after the blood had already soaked into the cloth. So the blood came first, then later this negative image of man. Now in 1978, they determined this to be a man. This was no hoax. First of all, they looked at his blood and said, that's real blood. They found a number of things in it. If you look closely at the blood on the arms and the hands, we'll come back to it, it looks very red still compared to the burn marks on the shroud. Now, a blood stain would turn brown after some time, unless the person's blood contained a high amount of bilirubins. It's a orangish, yellowish-like dye in the blood. And a body does produce that when it's under extreme stress. But they also found a hemoglobin in the blood, a particular protein or an enzyme that's also produced when a person is under extreme stress. They were able to pull a partial DNA, not a full DNA, but this sat on display for a lot of years in a fashion in which people could touch it. And so you can imagine people coming to this and they thought this was their Lord. They would want to touch him, touch his blood, touch something that's touched him. My kids would be rolling around in this. So only a partial DNA. Also, they determined it had an AB blood type. And I should tell you, in that 1978 STRP investigation, they took every precaution necessary to make sure that, that their results were not biased. There was one non-Christian scientist who came out of the STRP investigation, and he said, you know, I don't believe in Jesus Christ, essentially is what he said, so I don't think that's him. I think instead, but that is a real man. I think instead maybe as a Christian that they decided to torture like his Lord. And so they did things similar to him that was done to Jesus Christ. Now I want to go back to his head here, and I want to start to look at some of his wounds. Again, you see that blood around the forehead. Done by a crown of thorns, it appears, and some research has demonstrated that that crown wasn't just a wreath, that it was actually a dome. So there were branches that covered the entire top of his head. Now, if you're familiar with the crown that, you know, was on display in Notre Dame that was saved, it's safe, it's in a vault. You know that one to be just a wreath, probably. So how could that crown, you know, possibly be this crown if this is Jesus? There's not a small chance that that crown too was at one point a dome, and they would have used greener branches across the top of that crown, which would have decomposed over time, leaving just the wreath. I'm on the other side now, and you can see a lot of blood pooled here. That's actually blood at the base of the neck, where every time the head fell back, the crown of thorns actually pierced the nape of the neck. I want to take you to the hands. If you look closely, that wound in the hand is actually through the wrist. This was done for a couple of reasons. One, the fleshy tissue in the middle of the hand wouldn't hold the weight of the body on a cross. But two, also because you have a cluster of nerves in your wrist, and the Romans were perfecting Persian forms of crucifixion. And so they had a particular recipe in order to cause as much suffering as possible in a person before they expired. And it looked like this. They wanted their arms to be at a 15-degree angle on the cross, and they would drive that, and they were pretty exact about that. And they would drive the nail through that cluster of nerves so that the man would have to lift himself for every breath, and as he did, that nail through the cluster of nerves would send shooting pains and a burning sensation up the arms and into the body. Now, if you look closely at the hands, you can't see the thumbs because they're folded up underneath the hand. if you were to hold your hand out, your thumb doesn't just hang loose and fall down like it's on a hinge. It actually has both a muscle and a tendon that holds it in place. Some recent research demonstrated something quite interesting, though, about this man, and that's that he actually has 2 nail marks through his wrist. One is in the exact place needed to sever the muscle, and one is in the exact place needed to sever that tendon, which would have set the thumbs free. And then in rigor mortis, as the body stiffened, the thumbs would have stiffened up underneath the hands, and he was buried in that fashion. There is one theory that might explain that so far that's come to light, and whether this is 15th century or 1st century, that this man was crucified, tortured. He's 5'10", and that's tall either way. And the wonder there is because the Romans used to drive that nail through pre-drilled holes. If maybe they went to crucify him and actually couldn't get the angle right because he was so tall, the pre-drilled holes didn't work. And so it appears as if maybe they had to unnail him and re-nail him. I've gone to the back side again, and so you can see at the top of your screen that his head, and then his back, shoulders, down the legs, and we come to the feet. And do you see where his foot left an impression? And then the heel of his other foot. And you can see a lot of blood there. And the blood is actually exiting the heel bone. In archaeology, they've dug up some heel bones of people who were crucified in the 1st century or around that time. And a lot of times the nail is still sticking out of the heel bone. They would do this for the same reason they would go through the bone cluster in the wrist. 1, it would hold the weight on the cross. And 2, they would make sure that the knees during crucifixion were at just the right angle, so that the man would have to lift himself for every breath. And there too, in the heel, is a cluster of nerves. So at every breath, that nail would cause shooting pains and a burning sensation up the legs and up into the waist. We're still on the back here, and I'm showing you, again, the back of his head and his back and the back of his shoulders. And if you look, you can see a lot of blood right there. That's where the blood ran both off the wound of in his side and also down his arms and pooled at his elbows and pooled here on the back side of the shroud. But I wanted to show you his back where he has scourge marks. There are 4 kind of whips, Roman phlegrims we call them, on display in Rome. All of them have leather strands about 1 foot long. Now, again, Romans were trying to perfect forms of torture. And it used to be that phlegrims were longer. The thought was the longer the strap, the faster the speed at the end and the more pain. And then the Romans realized if we shorten it, we actually lose momentum, force at the end, so we need to shorten the strands. And they found a foot long to be about right. And so at the end of these leather straps, they would have various things. I'm going to take you down the legs here so you can see more scourge marks down the legs. They would have various things tied to the end of these straps, chunks of animal bone, rocks, porcelain, glass, all sorts of things. But the 4th kind of Roman phlegrum on display in Rome has 2 iron beads tied to the end of each of the 3 straps. So we're going to zoom in here, and if you look very carefully at these wounds, they are in pairs of 2. I'll point one out right here for you. 2 metal beads there. Trying to hold the camera steady. There we go. Patterns of 2 all throughout, across his back. And you see how they're in a pattern. Forensics has told us a lot about this shroud just in the last couple of years even. It'll be amazing, I think, what it'll be able to share with us here in the coming years, even just in the next couple of years. But sciences like these have been able to tell us that there were 2 men scourging this man, one standing on either side of him. You can see the pattern. They stood in certain places and scourged for a bit. Again, you can see those pairs of 2 on his calves pretty clearly. It was also able to determine that one man scourging him was slightly taller than the other. Isn't that wild? So he has 250 scourge marks across his entire body, including the front side. I'll show you in a moment. It's a little hard to see, but if you look across his chest, you see scourge marks there as well. Again, the pairs of two iron beads. And then if we go further down, you can see him on the front of his legs, even his shins. They would scourge a man on one side for some time, and then they would flip him over and scourge him on the other. And if I take you back to essentially the photograph, you can see the scourge marks pretty clearly, all up and down his body. This man would have left the scourging body in shock, both from the brutality of it. The scourging was quite brutal. Sometimes it ended in death, and also because of the blood loss. I'm starting to stop in here so I don't make you seasick. I want to take you to the wound in the side. It can be kind of hard to see because of the patch. But there it is right there. Now it appears to be on his left side, but remember this image is flopped, so it's actually on his right side. Some things that are wild about this photographic negative is it's also a 3D negative. If I were to take a photograph of you, it wouldn't contain any 3D information within it. Unless I'm using the newest iPhone, apparently. But somehow this photographic negative contains all the 3D information in it necessary to reproduce all of his three-dimensional proportions, and that's digitally confirmed to be the case. Further, what's wild about this is that it's a bit of an X-ray image, so I'm going to take you back to the photograph of his face. Look at his teeth. If you look closely, you can actually make out, it helps when this is digitally enhanced, but you can actually make out his teeth. And when I take you back to the hands here, his fingers look long, they look elongated. Reason being, you're actually seeing through the skin, you're seeing the bones too. On the teeth, you're seeing through the lips. This is a bit of an X-ray image, and we can see into the wounds a little bit too. And I mention that because we can actually see a little bit into this wound. When it's digitally enhanced, you won't be able to see it. But when they digitally enhance it, they can actually see the wound, and they've compared it to a Roman pilum, a spear, and that does look like that weapon could have been used. It is a match, not to say it wasn't another weapon. What's interesting about this too is that when you look at the angle that whatever that was entered that wound, it cuts right up between this man's 5th and 6th rib, which means it would have struck what's called the pericardial sac before it hit the heart. And if you remember, they saw, the gospel accounts, blood and water coming forth from Christ's side. The pericardial sac contained within it a clear-like fluid, so that could explain the water as well as the blood. One more stop at the hands here. Notice one arm is longer than the other. It looks like his left, but again, the image is reversed, so it's his right arm. Some recent research, it's been going on for a little while, but more recently published, and just the beginnings of it were published, looked at that, and your first thought might be shoulder dislocation, and that could be the case. But they noticed not only was the right arm drooping, and it could have been dislocation, they said, but here, remember the image is flopped back to what it should be, and so the right side of the face leaves less of an impression on the shroud. It appears as if the right side of his face is drooping as well. And by the way, there's a lot of swelling. There's a lot of things going on here in this man's face, some of which we'll come back to. But the eye is also drooping in the orbital bone. And really, they found some droopage across the entire right upper side of his body. And they appeared to uncover recently that actually this man's experiencing paralysis on the right upper side of his body, arm, chest, shoulder, back, face. The thing that would cause that is a blunt force strike to a nerve that would run right between the neck and into the shoulder. But it would take some force. If this is Jesus, maybe even another man, the thing that might cause that force, that might have that kind of weight, would be the weight of the cross. If it struck him on the back of the shoulder, neck area. Even if he's carrying the cross beam alone, that's upwards of 100 pounds. And so it's that kind of force, that kind of weight, and that kind of strike that would cause a paralysis like that. That, they concluded, would have rendered him unable to carry anything at that point. That's pretty consistent with the gospel accounts. They needed Simon of Cyrene to help Jesus. So under a Roman edict in which they could force anybody to carry, Roman soldiers to carry their stuff up to 1 mile for them, they forced Simon of Cyrene to help Jesus carry his cross. The other thing worthy of mentioning, and it may be related, they actually found a high amount of dirt on the left knee, as well as on the nose. And of course, it makes sense on the bottom of his feet, but the knee and the nose might make sense of some sort of fall. So I wanted to give you one more shot of this in its entirety. Where did this thing come from? How is it produced? When? Where has it been? I'll get into all that tomorrow. But I want to leave you with this thought. Whether this is our Lord or not, why did he have to give himself in this way? Truth is, he could have saved himself from crucifixion. He could have saved us another way. But he chose and allowed this. God is the perfection of love, and love gives everything. Suffers, sacrifices, everything. And I'll leave you this quote from St. Augustine. He said that God loves each of us as if there was only one of us. And so if you were the only one who needed to be loved in this way, this gift, he would have done this just for you. And so, in fact, in a mystical sense, he did do all of this just for you.